Sharing your data for an affirmative action plan. We're talking about the workforce snapshot today. My name is Carla Irwin. I'm the president of Carla Irwin & Associates. My firm provides full-service affirmative action support, including strategy, affirmative action plan development, audit support, and training. And co-presenter in this presentation is Stephanie Thomas. She's the founder and CEO of Thomas Econometrics.
Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie. And Thomas Econometrics, just to give you a really quick summary, we are a full-service quantitative consulting firm, and we specialize in quantitative analyses of workforce issues. And before we get started today, Carla and I just want to remind you that nothing in this presentation should be interpreted or construed as legal advice. We're presenting some information. It's not to be interpreted as legal advice. If you have questions about legal issues or what the law is, how it pertains to your particular organization, you really should consult with your employment specialist.
All right. Talk a little bit about this webinar series. This is really about getting back to basics. And the OFCCP is very busy right now. There's a lot of regulations, a lot of changes that are happening. And we kind of just decided, let's just stop, take a breath, and, go back to the basics, the foundation. And that's really the data. So this webinar series is really about looking at the foundation of your data, the foundation of your plan, your data, helping you try and pull that data, pull the right fields, clean it up, and make it the best possible plan that you can.
And this is the fourth in our series. We planned 6. We've already talked about hiring, promotion, terminations, and today we're going to talk about the workforce snapshot. On November 9th, we'll be talking about applicant flow and the kinds of data issues that we encounter there. And then the last in the first series will be on compensation, and that's going to take place on November 30th. So we'll round out our Back to Basics series at the end of November. And we are planning a second series that's going to focus on these same 6 core issues: hiring, promotion, termination, workforce snapshot, applicant flow, and compensation. But in the second part of the series, we're really going to move it over toward the changes in the scheduling letter, what you need to do to be prepared to produce your data, how the scheduling letter changes that are currently underway will impact what you need to do and how you need to produce. So we anticipate announcing dates for that in the near future, so be sure to check our blogs and our websites for more information. But we are working on a second series that's focusing on scheduling letter preparedness.
Okay. Before I go on to the next slide, I had a question posed that sound was lost, and so I wanted to see if that was still the case. Obviously, if you can't hear me, then you can't hear this message. But could you send another message if you're having issues with sound at all? Okay, got the message that everything's okay and can hear. Okay, just wanted to make sure before we moved on that everyone could hear us. All right.
Okay, so today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the workforce snapshot files, or your roster files, and we're going to cover the same broad 3 areas that we've covered before. We're going to talk about the data requirements and what data elements you need for your affirmative action plan. We're talking about missing data and the effect it has on your affirmative action plan. And we'll give you some tips on data scrubbing and validation, and we'll walk you through some of the things that we look for when we're reviewing this roster file or the workforce snapshot file to make sure that it's comprehensive and complete.
Okay, so let's start with what's the data that you need to pull for your workforce snapshot. The workforce snapshot really being the foundation data for your goals, your workforce analysis, job group analysis, availability, all of that. So really important data. So first, it needs to be at the employee level. So each employee gets a line of data. Here's some of the fields that you need to have. This is kind of the base information that you need to have. First is employee name and number, and I kind of mentioned this on each of the webinars. I prefer employee number because it's unique, because you can have employees with the same name. and it's really helpful to have employee number on all the logs. It helps when you're doing double checking, so employee number. One thing I will note is that don't use Social Security number. That's obviously confidential information of your employees, and you don't want to be producing that information. Having it in report, if you don't have to, and or sending it to a consultant or law firm that you may be working with on your affirmative action plan. So, employee number is best, employee name if you don't have that. Race, gender, ethnicity, obviously you need to have that. Job title, and then you need to have your EEO-1 code, which everybody has to fill out their EEO-1 report. Job group, if you are a company who has 100 or more employees, you need to have a more detailed job group. They're kind of sub-classifications of your EEO-1 code. Census codes, if you have them in your system. If you don't have them in your system, I would suggest by job title creating a table in an Excel spreadsheet that is by job title, what the census code, so that it's easy year over year. You can put those in very quickly if you can't get them into your HRIS system. And the same for AA job group. Not all HRIS systems, or if you have a homegrown or an issue with that in your system, I would suggest putting it together in an Excel spreadsheet so you kind of have that year over year. FLSA status, so exempt, non-exempt status, and your full-time or part-time status. So these are key points that you need to have for each employee. Department and location. Department obviously helps us create the departments for your workforce analysis. Location obviously to help break it up by AAP if you're pulling all of your data at once. Hire, rehire, termination, promotion dates, all of that kind of thing. Definitely hire, rehire. If they're terminated, they're probably not on their promotion date. But really making sure that that termination and promotion dates are really on there to make sure that you have them in the other logs. The base information is hire or rehire. The termination, if you are a employer that has high turnover, that could be really important to have to have the rehire and termination dates. You can really check when someone gets hired and then terminates and then gets rehired. That's a really good double check. Make sure you have the right number of hires and terminations on your employment activity log. Your salary grade or compensation information. Not everybody has a salary grade. They might have a salary band. You might call it something different. If you don't have that, that's all right. But definitely compensation information needs to be on their base salary. A quick note about this. The new scheduling letter, which we're going to be, Stephanie mentioned, we're going to be doing the new webinar series on. This compensation information is one of the big areas, one of the hot areas. And they're actually going to be asking at the scheduling letters at the desk audit stage in the scheduling letter for your base compensation, wage rate for those hourly folks, hours worked. So those are going to be things that could also be on the required data once that new scheduling letter gets on place, because you're going to want to analyze that. In addition, they're kind of asking for optionally, they kind of use the word should, include with your desk audit submission, bonus, merit, overtime, things like that. Some additional factors may be education, past experience. And I'm mentioning this because it's really a good time for you to think about what you have in your system, what you have paper. Know that the OFCCP is going to be asking for it in the event of an audit, so you probably want to start thinking about how you might get it in the most effective and efficient way for your company. And then finally, manager name. This is a really important one. One, it kind of helps with the grouping in terms of departments. It also helps, we'll talk a little bit later about validating EEO and job group codes. But this is really the base information that you're going to need for your workforce snapshot in order to create all the reports that you're going to need.
And just one thing to follow up here on the required data. Since we're talking about the workforce snapshot file or the roster file, it's really important that all of these characteristics, all of these employee-specific pieces of information are captured as of the date of your snapshot. So, for instance, if you're taking a snapshot of your workforce on December 31st, you want to make sure that the data set that you have reflects the job title, the EEO1 group, the job group, department, location, all those things as of the date of your snapshot. So it's important to be consistent with when you're pulling the data. You want to pull it all at once, and you want to make sure that everybody's characteristics are as of the same date. And the way to think of a workforce snapshot really is you're taking a picture at a specific moment in time of what your workforce looks like. So just keep in mind that it's really important that all of these characteristics are captured as of the snapshot date.
And kind of a technical point for those who may be new to pulling this data, you should really know whether your HRIS system or if you're pulling it out of your payroll system holds history. And this is really important to Stephanie's point, is you need it as of the point of the snapshot date. If you pull it 2-3 weeks later, if there was a change in compensation, if there was a change in job title, department manager, any of that, then it's going to show only the new, not at the time of the snapshot. So really think about how closely to that snapshot date that you pull the report so that it is as accurate as possible. If you have a system that does not hold history, which is very likely in the event that you're using a payroll system versus a true HRIS system. So that's good to know in advance and find that out.
Okay, and in addition to the required data, the absolute essentials that you need on the employee level, I'm going to tell you again that it's a good idea to keep expanded demographic information on other protected characteristics. Keep your date of birth along with you when you pull that data. Chances are you're going to have that in your system somewhere. Pull it along when you extract all these other data elements. Things like disability status, veteran status, marital status. If you have data on sexual orientation, if you're required under certain jurisdictions to keep that information, anything that you have about these expanded demographics, just pull it when you create that snapshot file. It's much easier to bring it in while you're preparing everything than have to go back and try to append it or tack it on to the end of a file. So capture everything that you possibly can about these additional demographic characteristics when you pull that initial report. It'll make it a lot easier in the long run.
And we have disability and veteran status highlighted. First, those are statuses that you keep in your system. One for affirmative action purposes, because you have not only an AAP for females and minorities, which is kind of the numbers that we're talking about now, but you have a narrative plan for now with regard to disability and veteran status, but also a reminder that your that's 100 or 100A report is coming up due. It's past due because it's typically due September 30th with their EEO1 report, but the vet's office is having some issues. Last announcement they put out, you'll be able to start inputting that information come November 1st, but I wouldn't be hugely surprised if they put that off again.
Okay, so let's talk about the required documentation that you need. As we've said many times before, electronically maintained information is best. It's going to give you a central repository. You'll have everything you need right in one place, easily accessible. You want to keep information on any employment decision that you make. So the things that we talked about specifically for hiring, promotions, and terminations in the last 3 webinars, all those things apply. You want to keep all those same kinds of documentation. You also want to keep information about compensation. And we're going to talk about compensation in the 6th webinar. But when we say compensation, what I'm really talking about here is not just what the person's hourly rate is or what their salary rate is or what bonus plan they're eligible for. I'm really talking about compensation decision documentation. And we need to figure out, or we need to have documentation about how a person's salary rate or pay rate was really determined. It's not arbitrarily set. You went through some process to figure out what the person's compensation should be. Maybe you used industry statistics or salary surveys. If you use performance evaluations and part of that compensation setting process, all of those things need to be maintained. So you need to keep copies of the salary surveys. You need to keep copies of the industry benchmarking statistics, performance evaluations, validation of the criteria that go into the performance evaluations. So it's really about more than just what the hourly wage rate is and what the number of hours worked are. It's really about the compensation decision and what documentation you have to support the decisions that you made. You also want to keep information about full-time and part-time status. As Carla mentioned in the required data, you obviously want to have a full-time, part-time status indicator in the data, but you also need to maintain the documentation about any changes, like if a person goes from full-time to part-time or part-time to full-time, when that change took place, who initiated the change. Was it the company initiated the change, or was it the employee requesting a status change? The particular circumstances. You know, if somebody, one of your employees comes to you and says, I'm going back to school to finish my degree and I really need to go from full-time to part-time to be able to do that, you want to have a record of that conversation. You want to have that documented. So in the event that you need to go back and figure out when somebody went from full-time to part-time and why, you have all that information right there. FLSA status is another hot area. It's important that you have documentation about how you classified your employees as either exempt or non-exempt. FLSA and wage and hour litigation is one of the hot issues. It's a really big issue, and in my opinion, it's one of the biggest exposure areas for employers right now, the exempt and non-exempt classification. So if you had industrial studies done to see how much time a particular job typically spends during the day doing exempt versus non-exempt activities, the justifications for choosing to classify a position as exempt or non-exempt, you want to maintain all that documentation. It's going to be really important in the event of a wage and hour investigation. If your compensation practices are looked at by the OFCCP, private litigation, it's absolutely critical that you have a comprehensive record of what positions were classified which way and how those decisions were made. We also want to keep information about any leaves of absence, whether that's just a temporary leave, if it's an FMLA leave, if it's a short-term or a long-term disability leave. We want to make sure that we have start and end dates, that you have the appropriate documentation. If there's, you know, medical documentation that needs to be maintained to initiate the leave or to return from the leave, you want to make sure that you have all that information. You also want to keep information about any disability accommodations that you make. It's difficult to do this because the accommodation is such an individualized process. So you really need to keep essentially a separate accommodations file on an employee who asks for an accommodation. You want to document what the nature of the issue is, what accommodations the employee requested, what accommodations you considered, and what ultimately was done to accommodate this person. So it's really important to document that interactive process with your employees when you're working on these accommodations. And finally, anything else that you consider when you're making an employment decision, whether that's a hire, a promotion, a termination, a reassignment, a transfer, any kind of employment decision that you make, you need to be sure that you have documentation about when you did it, how you did it, and why you did it. So make sure that you've got documentation about all those kinds of things.
A couple notes as to what may be happening with the new scheduling letter in terms of required documentation. If the new scheduling letter goes through approved as is, you will be required to submit accommodation logs, so that, you know, what Stephanie said about really tracking your accommodations, very important. You'll be required to submit them at the desk audit stage. You'll also be required to submit compensation info on all full-time, part-time, contract per diem, day labor, and temporary folks as of 2/1. They chose the date of February 1st for tax purposes. They thought everybody would be done with their getting all the compensation stuff together for their employees the end of January 31st for tax purposes. So those are two big changes and big points to make. In addition, FLSA status this is definitely a hot issue. Wage and hour is all over it. IRS is all over it. And just recently, the Department of Labor signed a memorandum of understanding with the IRS to help improve kind of departmental efforts to end this employee misclassification issue. So OFCCP will be collecting it at the time of the desk audit, and they're going to be throwing it over the fence to wage and hour and IRS. So that's important to note going.
And just to follow up on that, the memorandum of understanding with the IRS, that really relates not only to the exempt versus non-exempt classification, but they're also focusing on employee versus independent contractor status. It's a whole separate issue that we're really not going to get into here, but just be aware that it's not limited to exempt and non-exempt. It's including the employee versus independent contractor distinction as well.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some common missing data points that I see when doing AAPs. The first one is employee ID. So again, like I said, employee ID is the best thing to provide and the best thing to use for comparative reasons between the logs, because employees' names can be the same. So if at all possible, get employee ID there. Manager name is another one. This can be something that's really difficult for companies to keep up with. Some companies have a problem with it, some don't. If you have a lot of people who transfer among departments based on what the workflow is, this can be really hard to keep up with, but that is one that I see as an issue. So it's kind of just figuring out what's the best way to manage that. Is it trying to manage, their departments all throughout the year, or do you really just update whoever their manager is as of your snapshot date so that you're cleaning it up, for the data pool, if you're not using it for any other purposes? FLSA status, I see a lot of people not inputting that in, or they're thinking that's salary versus hourly, and that is different from exempt versus non-exempt. So I sometimes also ask for salary versus hourly in addition to FLSA status. Census code. So we talked about this, and that's why I mentioned kind of creating a table. If you can't get this into your system, creating an Excel table that by job title has your EEO1 code, AA job group code, and census code. If that's something that you can't get out of your system, I get a lot of data that's missing the census code, and that's just really extra time that it takes. Salary grade or band. Again, I request this and really validate whether clients have something in place. If they don't have a salary grade or band in place, I may ask for, do you have lines of progression that you have for certain job titles? Recent hires and recent terminations, I'm going to talk about those in conjunction. The reason that I see the recent hires or recent terms, meaning those hires and terms that are kind of leading up to the workforce snapshot date, is because whoever is entering that information, whether it's someone in HR, HRIS, whether it's hiring managers, whoever it is, it hasn't quite been entered yet. So if you're pulling your workforce snapshot, on the date or a few days after the snapshot date, possibly those recent hires or recent terms haven't been put in there. So your snapshot doesn't include the hires that happened just days before, or may include people who were terminated in the days leading up. So really getting that organized with the folks that input your AAP or that input your activity data to make sure that you kind of give them some timelines once your AAP date comes around. So that's also very important.
Okay, so let's talk about some common data pitfalls. And the biggest area of issue that I see with respect to the workforce snapshot file or the roster file is timing. There's a lot of timing issues to think about when you're constructing this file. The biggest thing is really you want to capture your entire workforce as of a specific point in time. So you don't want to include employees that were terminated prior to the snapshot date. You don't want to include employees that were hired after the snapshot date. And you don't want to include employees that were hired and terminated within the year. So the timing is really important. And again, I really can't stress enough that we're taking a picture of the workforce as of a certain date. So we only want to have people who are active on that particular date in the roster file. So think about when your employees were terminated, when they were hired, if they come and go, if you have high turnover, then you may need to take a second look at whether or not you're including people who were hired and termed in the same year. The other issue that I see frequently is the incorrect job titles, job groups, locations, departments, pay rates, and so forth. And again, we want to make sure that we're capturing these characteristics as of a specific date. And it's important that everybody's characteristics are captured on the same date. You don't want to have somebody's characteristics from December 30th and another person's characteristics from January 1st. You want to make sure that you're consistent with the date that you use and make sure that everybody's characteristics are recorded as of that particular date. Usually it's not too much of a problem unless you're going back to historically create a snapshot file. So if you want to take a snapshot, for instance, on December 31st, if you pull the data on December 31st, the incorrect job titles, job groups, etc., really won't be that much of a problem. If you try to create a snapshot file for December 31st, but you pull the data in February or March, then you have more of an issue here because there's been time for these characteristics to change. So it really, from my perspective, the data pitfalls really come down to the timing of when you create that snapshot file, what the snapshot date is, and making sure that you have the people and their characteristics as of that date.
We've kind of talked about a lot of these data pitfalls and issues, and I know I've been speaking to systems and HRIS systems or AAP systems. I want to make a note about those people who are doing it manually. So they're really, they have the roster and the workforce snapshot that they update every year. They, keep a going log of hires, terms, and promos. What I see with those of you who are doing it manually, you clear out your employment activity logs and you add in, as people are hired, you put that on the log. People are terminated, you put that on the log. People are promoted, you put that on the log. And you keep up with that. What happens is then are you then going to the roster spreadsheet, taking off the terms, adding on the hires, changing the titles for promotion. So that's really important, creating a process if you are doing this manually.
So as we've said several times before, if you have bad data, you're going to have a bad AAP. The statistics are only as good as the data that generates them. And if you have bad data, you can get inaccurate conclusions. If your snapshot file isn't capturing the right people, if it's not capturing the correct characteristics for those people, you can have inaccurate conclusions generated from your analysis. And these inaccurate conclusions can really mask where your real issues are. As I've said before, if an inaccurate conclusion can make it seem as though you have a gender or a race or an age problem with a particular group, when in fact there really is no problem. It's an artificially created problem because of issues in your data. And the opposite can also happen. You can think that you're perfectly fine with respect to gender, ethnicity, race, age, but because your data is really bad, it looks like you're okay, but there really is a problem that the bad data is covering up. So it's really important to make sure that your data is as clean and as comprehensive as possible. And only through good, clean data are you able to get accurate conclusions that are going to tell you where your real issues are.
And two of those things that you're using with this data is one, the goals, and goals are really the heart of your AAP. That's you know where you need to do your outreach, and so if your goals are incorrect and it's giving you inaccurate conclusions, you could be creating programs that you don't really need to be, or you're not creating programs where you should be, and you're really spending a lot of time and effort that you don't need to be. And and your efforts are going to be, could ultimately be useless. And second, with regard to compensation, I think it's, equally and almost more important is if you don't have the right compensation or you don't have the right date for compensation, you're really analyzing this in preparation for an OFCCP audit, but also if you need to make adjustments, that kind of thing. So it's really important that you have the good, clean data with regard to this report.
And bad data or missing data is really a time sink, it's expensive, and it's a drain on your resources. There's both internal and external costs. If you have to go back and recreate some data, if you have to fill in a lot of blanks, if your data is very spotty, your internal people are going to be tied up with that project, and they're not going to be able to focus on the things that they need to do on a daily basis. So it can really be a drag on your productivity if you have a lot of internal people wrapped up in going through this data cleaning, filling in the data, trying to go back and reconstruct history. From an external cost perspective, if you give your consultants and your experts data that isn't really clean and it's not comprehensive and there's a lot of data errors, then that's going to increase the cost of working with that consultant because you're going to have to do that back and forth, filling in missing data points, making corrections. All of that's going to add to the external cost of the analysis or the AAP preparation. So really good, solid, clean data can save you time, it'll save you money, and it'll save on your resources.
And when we're talking about in preparation for an audit, you have 30 days to respond to the scheduling letter. So that's a very short amount of time. And with the changes that are coming with the new scheduling letter, especially with regard to compensation, having as much time as possible is important, and having good data and able to answer this quickly is going to be very important, because this new scheduling letter and the things that they're going to be asking for is really going to take you some more time, and having that clean in advance is going to be key to a good audit, a good outcome in your audit.
And with respect to the audit and litigation issues, the idea here is that missing data really can make or break your case. You need to have a documented paper trail of your data. Any changes that you make to your data, you want to have a data corrections log. You want to have some record of what you changed, when you changed it, and why you changed it. And just to go back to that whole FLSA wage and hour issue, there's a lot of activity around FLSA right now. There's a lot of private litigation going on. The Wage and Hour Division is really looking at this issue very carefully. So it's really important that you have your employees properly classified, that you have their classifications recorded correctly, and you have documentation supporting why you classified them in a certain way. It's sort of like being presumed guilty until proven innocent. If you don't have documentation about why your classification as exempt or non-exempt is appropriate, or why your classification as an employee versus independent contractor is appropriate, there's going to be a tendency for the regulators to assume that you've done it wrong. So, like we said with the comparator pools, if you don't define them, somebody else is going to define them for you. So it's really important, particularly with respect to FLSA right now, that this exempt, non-exempt, employee, independent contractor information is maintained, that it's consistent, and that it's accurate.
Before we go on, I've just got a question about, whether we think that the scheduling letter, this last revision is going to go through, whether the OMB is going to address some of the concerns and comments, and when do I think that this letter will kind of go into effect. I think that the letter will probably be approved by the end of this year, beginning of next year, and kind of be effective probably January 1st. I think that that's probably about the timing that it's going to happen. And do I think that there's going to be huge changes to the scheduling letter from what we see today? No, I don't. They came back with very minor changes to their original, and they, I don't want to use the word disregard, but they really felt like they had justification and need for this data. I think it goes along, it's really hand in hand. They kind of set the stage first with the new active case enforcement. They moved from the active case management to active case enforcement. This is kind of a good point for where we're at here in terms of audit litigation issues. They are really enforcing the full AAP. They're not just looking at adverse impact anymore. They're really looking at the full components, the basics, your outreach, your reports, are they correct? And so that's kind of why this is really important. And then now not only are they enforcing it in a different way and at a different level, kind of more in terms of quality versus quantity, as they have said with their new active case enforcement, but now they're adjusting the scheduling letter to try and get more data from you. And I really do think that it's probably going to go through almost the way you see it today. I wish that was a different answer because it is going to mean more work for all of you, but that is kind of my opinion. Any thoughts from you, Stephanie, on that one?
I agree. I think that if it doesn't go through in the way it's written right now, the changes are going to be very insignificant and very minor. I think we're likely to see it enacted the way it is right now.
Yeah. And a part of it is, a big part of it is compensation. And compensation is a huge issue with the administration right now. This gender wage gap. I know Stephanie's put a ton of information out there. Go to her website and read a lot that she has on there. But this wage gender gap is big for this administration. And the OFCCP is the one kind of civil rights agency that can really go in and look at that. The same with getting the accommodation logs for people with disabilities and things like that. So I think that we're going to see a lot of that come through. Okay. So now that you kind of know the data that we are going to be looking for, what are some of the data issues? Do we have the right people? Actually, I have another question come through, and I think it's on the schedule approved. Do you think the OCCP will give us any implementation time? I don't know that they will. I think suddenly they will be using the new scheduling letter. I don't know how. I don't know that for sure. When it went to from active case management to enforcement, no, that was a directive versus kind of regulations that they didn't give any implementation time. We'll have to see. I don't know the answer. Thank you for the question. Okay, so now that we know what are the fields, what are the issues of bad data, let's kind of move on to what are some of the data scrubbing and validation that both Stephanie and I do when we get data from our clients. And first is do you have the right people? And first is kind of looking at a year-over-year analysis, making sure that you don't have any of the termed employees on the roster, making sure that everyone that you hired within the past year is on the roster unless they've termed again. And, possibly if you have a lot of transfers in your company, either between divisions or locations, keeping a transfer log. So we've talked about it in the other webinars with regards to your employment activity, but you need to kind of look at it in conjunction. So you're making sure that you have all the hires on the hire log, all the terms on the term log, all the promotions that happen. So a lot of that comes with this year-over-year analysis of this workforce snapshot, and that's what you really need to start with. And that's what we're suggesting here is okay, look at the same point in time report that you had from last year and look at it this year. Make sure that everybody from a hire and term perspective is on there, and if there are any title changes from last year to this year, are they picked up in the promotion log if they need to be? So that's the first kind of step in terms of do you have all of the right people? Bullet point will come up. Then is do we have the right codes? And so I talked a lot about in the prior webinars about using your workforce snapshot as the base document for having all the right codes. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. One that I mentioned earlier is having by job title in an Excel spreadsheet if you have an issue with it in your system, having the right EEO1 code, AA job group code, and census code. And that may even be a good idea, even if you have it in your system, because if you have a system that doesn't automatically change the EEO, AAP code, census code, if you change the job title, what can happen is you change the job title, and then all of the other codes stay the same in the system, and you're pulling it down. So, that still may be a good idea. Another step to do is, use your workforce snapshot that you had cleaned up from the previous year, compare it by job title for all of the right codes. And then for any new job titles that you have, work on either with your consultant, if you're outsourcing your AAPs, or really looking through the census codes, analyzing your EEO1 and AA job group codes, either as those jobs are created or at the end when you're doing the AAP and assigning the correct code. A couple things that I do in terms of the right codes. So obviously, I talked about comparing last year's codes, but the one thing that I do is check manager, supervisor codes. So sometimes certain people or certain job titles move in and out of being people managers. And so you really want to check that, that everyone with that 1.1 or 1.2 EEO code is in the manager column. Remember, that was a column that I said needed to be in your spreadsheet. And then check that everyone in the manager or supervisor column is coded as either a 1.1 or 1.2 EEO code, or in terms of AA job group codes, they have one of your management job group codes. So that's one of the big checks they do. I find a lot of issues in that area because people move from being people managers or not being people managers for whatever reason due to reorganization, different job classifications, that kind of thing.
One of the key areas of data scrubbing and validation for me is consistency. And the question I always ask is, are we consistent? And consistency can mean a lot of different things. Are you entering and recording information in a timely manner when some kind of an employment transaction event occurs? Do you enter, change in job titles or change in locations or departments? Do you enter those right away, or do you wait and process them in a batch at the end of the month? However you're doing it, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a consistent manner. How you're recording your leaves, how you record status changes, how you're classifying people in terms of exempt or non-exempt, and how you're recording that information. You need to be sure that all of those things are done in a consistent way and that they're done the same way for all of your employees. So, irrespective of what your particular processes or systems are, you need to make sure that you're using those processes and systems in a consistent manner for all employees, for all job groups, for all EEO1 categories, for all kinds of events. And the final thing that I look at is, where are the gaps in the data? And I mentioned this before. Looking at where your data gaps are can really give you some insight into where you can improve your processes and your policies. Are your gaps systemic, or are they random? Are you missing the same pieces of information for the same kinds of people, or is it more of a one-off kind of situation? Look at your data gaps with an eye to, how can I improve my policies and my procedures to make this whole data collection process smoother in the future, and how can I really tweak my processes to make sure that those gaps are filled in automatically, and that I don't have to go back and spend a lot of time cleaning the data. So figuring out where your gaps are now can really prevent future issues from occurring. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind with respect to data scrubbing and validation is that it is an interactive process. There is going to be a lot of interaction between you and your consultants or whoever's working on your AAP. And, part of this interactive process from my perspective is I like to see lists and exchange subfiles with the clients. And one of the things that I look for is radical differences in head counts from year to year. So if you had 2,500 employees last year and you have 1,300 employees this year, that's a pretty dramatic drop. So I may come back to you and say, what's going on? What happened? Did you have, a sale of a portion of the business? Did you go through a RIF? Is there something different about your turnover issues now? If the headcount dramatically increases, then I'm going to come back and say, you know, this is a pretty big increase. What happened? Did you acquire another piece of business? Did you expand? You know, what's really driving those changes? If it's a relatively small change in overall headcounts from year to year between the roster files, that's probably not something that's going to set off a flag. But if there are substantial differences in the headcounts, that's going to lead me to ask the question, did something happen in the business? Did something structurally change? Or is there something going on with the data pull and the data collection process that maybe we're missing people now that we should have, or we were missing people last year that we now are including? So radical differences in headcounts from year to year, for me, are a trigger that something's going on when we're talking about the snapshot files.
And one note is, you know, just to expect questions and have that interaction with your consultant, and don't kind of take it as, oh, I've done something wrong, or oh, why are you asking questions? Really look at it as a partnership, and you're both going to learn information and kind of make your AAP the best that it can be. So, you know, just be ready, be prepared. All the questions and comments that Stephanie just said, depending on what your data looks like, you know, your consultant, or you may find, if you're the one looking at your data and you're having to ask either HR or HRIS about what's going on within your company. These are all important things to know in advance. You don't want to find these things out once audit comes, because they'll all come out in the audit. Might as well find out your issues before then.
So the workforce snapshot file, or the roster file, really is the foundation data for your affirmative action plan. And it really is the source for a lot of validation that goes on with the employment logs. You know, when we talk about hiring events or promotion events or termination events, the workforce snapshot serves as part of the validation for those pieces. So it's critical that you get the workforce snapshot right. And if you have problems in your workforce snapshot data, if you have people that shouldn't be there, if you don't have people that should be there, if you have the wrong codes, if you have the wrong characteristics, it's going to give you a weaker foundation. And a weaker foundation is going to lead to a weaker affirmative action plan. And again, inaccurate data is going to lead to inaccurate conclusions. It can lead to misidentification of potential problem areas. You may think everything's okay when you really have an issue, or you may think that you have an issue that's really not there because of the bad data. So the workforce snapshot is really the key that the other employment logs are really built around. So take the time, look at your workforce snapshot, and make sure that it's the best it can be before moving forward.
And now more than ever, you want to find out your issues before the OFCCP does, because they will. So you really want to have your ducks in a row, and this workforce snapshot is, you know, absolutely the foundation for your AAP, for your goals, for your outreach plans. Are they effective? You know, so get it right the first time. Just want to take the time to thank everybody for attending. I'm just going to check and see if there are any additional questions. I don't see any. If you have any questions, I'm going to put up our contact information here. Feel free to contact either one of us. I have our website addresses, our phone numbers. We have email. Both websites have publications, information, newsletter, blog, ebooks. You know, those types of things are on the website. There's much more information. Feel free to contact us, either of us by phone or by email. And just wanted to say thank you for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Do we have any more questions?
I don't think so. That's it.
Okay, well, if anybody thinks of anything, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks.